Great. Welcome, everybody. Before we do our roll call, we're going to have two guests speak very quickly and help open up our meeting. If we could start with the video that we have, James.
Yeah, give me a second, please.
Well, good morning, everybody. It's Governor Gavin Newsom here, and I'm grateful. I'm immensely grateful to help kick off this convening of the Truth and Healing Council. I want you to know that the work you've done, the work that you're doing, and the conversations you are having matter deeply. We're listening. We're also committed to working together to restore your communities and honor what you've been through as the first peoples of this place. We know that California Native peoples have always had interdependent relations with the lands and waters, everything that now makes up the state of California. Unfortunately, we also know that the state has had a role in violently disrupting those relations, and of course in the mistreatment of California's lands and waters as well. To right some of these wrongs, I've tasked our administration with seeking out ways to support California Native peoples in accessing, co-managing, and acquiring your ancestral lands. And today, well, we're making a down payment on this commitment, allocating $100 million for tribally informed grant making to support tribal initiatives in this space. The initiatives funded under this commitment will be informed by your unique priorities and knowledge, ranging from climate programs and workforce development to tribal conservation and land returned for tribally led climate solutions. Through continued collaboration, we can work to include solutions driven by the first peoples of this state to build a more resilient, equitable, and thriving future for all Californians. Again, I'd just like to thank all of you for joining us in this effort, and I'm looking forward, as always, to continuing to be a resource for you as this important work moves forward.
Thank you. Wait, do you want to?
Yeah, sure. And I'll come up and sit because I think it could be helpful for those that are on video. I had a chance to be with I think most of you yesterday, but I want to just reintroduce myself. I'm Wade Crowfoot and I lead our Natural Resources Agency. I want to start by saying and acknowledging that, I, the governor, my colleagues here in state government, officially represent institutions that have perpetuated this discrimination, institutionalized racism, unthinkable violence on tribal communities over the last 170 years, and that's a heavy burden to carry. But it's also, I want to acknowledge it, as the institutions that that we now lead have a solemn obligation to redress this history, and I know that part of the Truth and Healing Council is acknowledging that and make sure that it's recorded and discussing it. And it's also redressing it and taking action to redress it. So we're really excited to be able to allocate an unprecedented amount of funding directly to tribes for the benefits, in our world of healing the lands and waters and caring for the lands and waters in a manner that recognizes the sovereignty of tribal government, that recognizes the leadership of tribal communities in stewarding these lands since time immemorial, and that recognizes the need for strengthened and institutionalized partnerships between our agency and tribal governments and tribal communities. A little bit of context from where we sit. We have major environmental crises to deal with. One of which is climate change, which is impacting our planet, but also impacting, what we know of as California. It's worsening wildfire, deepening drought, extreme heat across our state, flood risks, and sea level rise, and all that means. So our planet is in crisis. California is working to lead the way, transitioning our economy to really get the pollution out of the atmosphere or stop polluting the atmosphere as a way to continue to prosper as a species on a planet that needs us to change. So this clean energy revolution. But part of that is, like never before, recognizing that nature is needed in this effort to combat climate change. We know that the plants, the soils actually absorb, remove that carbon pollution from the atmosphere and store it in the lands. We also know that our nature is an important buffer to these climate impacts that I talked about, but it's an underutilized solution. We haven't done enough to heal our lands and waters to protect ourselves. And so that's in part, one of the areas of our priority and focus. We call it nature-based solutions, but it's nothing more than healing our lands and waters to, protect ourselves and all life in California. We also know that our plants and animals and other non-human species are in crisis, both across the world and even across our state. Our scientists tell us that we are living through the 6th mass extinction event in the planet's history, and the only one generated by humankind. In other words, actions of people are causing animals and plants and other life across the world to become extinct. California is one of the biodiversity hotspots in the world. We have a greater variety of plants and animals than almost anywhere in the world, but we also have huge stressors on that biodiversity, including climate change, but certainly development and our transportation corridors that disconnect habitat, et cetera. So we have a lot of work to do, not only to tackle climate change by better care for nature, but also to help the rest of life outside of human communities. So for all of these reasons, the governor set a really ambitious target to conserve 30% of our state by 2030. This is part of a global movement called 30 by 30, where countries, believe it or not, like Canada and France and Costa Rica and others are stepping up and saying they're going to conserve 30% of their nature by 2030. So we're stepping up and doing the same. Right now, we reckon about 24% of our land is conserved, and by conserved we mean protected from sort of the development like you'd see in downtown Sacramento that really removes the natural function of our lands and waters. So we have about 6 million plus acres of land, and about half of our coastal waters I should say about 16% of our coastal waters are conserved. So we have to double that amount in the next 8 years. We cannot do it in a way that disconnects people and nature. And it was actually Frankie that you're going to get sick of the story here, but because we talked about it this morning, but that educated me that, people have, and really more tribal leaders than Frankie, but that have educated me, people have always been at the center of nature. So this disconnection of so-called nature from people is kind of a colonialist construction. So we want to conserve this, 6 million additional acres in ways that expand access for Californians to be outdoors, including those communities, those people that don't currently have access. And importantly, in context of this discussion today, in ways that empower sovereign tribal governments to return to stewarding the lands and having the autonomy, the authority to steward the lands and waters. There's so much that we need to learn, obviously, from tribal communities around how to do this. Quite foolishly, 170 years, but really perpetuated almost to today, we've disconnected ourselves from all the tribal ecological knowledge that we need to heal and care for the lands. So that's all to say that the governor in his talk announced that we are seeking $100 million of state funding that would go directly to tribes for this stewardship. We're committed to developing a structure, a process where tribes are deciding where those funds are going. So where this is not a sort of a traditional grant process where we sit back and pick certain tribes to do this, that we're actually committed to creating some type of structure where it's tribal leaders that are identifying where these funds are being spent. And that includes for land acquisition to return ancestral lands to tribal ownership and control, co-management of whether it's our forests and our rivers, our resources, capacity building. Some of our tribal governments have natural resource departments with a lot of capacity, others don't have a lot of capacity. And really, from my perspective, the uses of that $100 million need to be shaped by tribal leaders and sort of the tribal knowledge. So we're going to be working over the next 3 months to secure the $100 million through the budget. And we're excited, after we shared this with you today, to reach out to legislative leaders to let them know about this. And that really is our commitment. It does build on an additional $40 million we have in funding, which is focused, again, almost a transfer of funds directly to tribes for forest management on wildfire. And I think this is really where we need to go in terms of redressing these historic, discrimination and atrocities. In other words, acknowledging our history, but then moving to write the history or create a new history by actually establishing these true co-equal partnerships. So I'm excited about this. I want to acknowledge Geneva E.B. Thompson. Geneva is our first ever Assistant Secretary for Tribal Affairs, and is bringing that tribal knowledge and wisdom and perspective to our work. And so I could bore you and tell you a bunch of other things that we're doing, but I'll leave it there and just let you know that Geneva and I, certainly Christina as the governor's key partner on all of these issues, are going to be working to build this $100 million in a manner that is respectful and advances the work. And I presume that there'll be consultation to help shape the use of funding if we're able to secure it. And I'd be glad to answer, any questions or hear any insight or feedback that you have.
Is 100 million enough?
No,
Yeah, it's not at all.
no. And the governor, internally and externally, I think he said it here too, it's a down payment. And by a down payment, we understand that there's, what I'd like to see is that we institutionalize these sources of funding. So it's not episodic, like on again, off again. Because from my perspective, environmental stewardship needs consistency.
It needs to be like water, it continues to flow. And my thing again, I apologize for my intellect, lack of it, but you keep mentioning tribal leadership, and that there is a difference that the government created a wedge between federally recognized Indians, non-federally recognized Indians. Those non-federally recognized Indians are really in dire shape of being recognized and receiving some of the benefit of this, whether it be through employment, assisting with this. I'm a fan of the environment, and I do believe that the human spirit really needs to connect to it, but I also know that the public is very rude and very selfish. And when you overpopulate an area, you have destroyed that environment. So those are the areas that I think we can collectively help you, but I want to make sure that it is those non-federally recognized Indians that get to have a play in this as well.
Well, thank you for that. And that's really helpful. And I've been educated on that point in my 3 years in this role. And so our focus would be funding for both federally recognized tribes and those tribes that don't have that recognition. And I'll give you an example. We're starting to get resources to non-federally recognized tribal communities. And so, for example, we were able to provide a grant to the Esalen tribal community in Monterey County, which is a landless tribe that's not federally recognized, to actually acquire upwards of, I think, 2,000 acres of land, which is their first, land that they've controlled in well over 150 years. So we recognize the need to work with tribes regardless of their recognition by the federal government.
Thank you.
Great.
I have a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned 3 specific categories: land acquisition, co-management, capacity building. So is it only within those categories that you're allowing spending, or is it anything that tribes identify as it?
That's a great question. It's not, those 3 categories are really examples of what the tribes, that the funding could be. So I think, we're working to identify what would be a structure for tribal decision-making on this, so that, there would be, a broad range of uses. I think we have to, because this will be the first kind of transfer of its kind, and specifically for tribes, we're trying to figure out how do we provide for, the autonomous decision-making of tribes for this money, and then, meet the criteria of state funding getting out of the door. So we're working through that. And again, what we're hoping to do is actually have a proposal that not only would we seek, broad input on, but then we would invite government to government consultation or discussions with non-government tribal governments as well to really shape that.
Just a brief question. Are we simply talking about, we're talking about land acquisition, transfer, are we simply talking about public lands, federal or state, or are we also talking about privately held lands?
Both. So I think in this case, one thing we're working on under the governor's ancestral tribal land return policy is essentially like the first thing that you do when we have excess lands within our agencies is identify, are there tribes to return these lands to? So those are public lands. But then also this funding, in my mind anyways, could be used for acquisition of private land. So that example I gave for the Esalen tribal community, that was actually an acquisition of a private ranch. Yep.
Great, and okay, we'll have one more question.
No,
Please, I don't want to.
I was just curious because only speaking obviously from my perspective and knowing non-federally recognized tribes, not all non-federally recognized tribes want to go a nonprofit route. And unfortunately, that's the route which most non-federally recognized tribes have to go in order to be able to file for grant funding or to be able to take acquisition of land in partnership. How are you going to work with those non-federally recognized partners that their governments don't want to diminish their own sovereignty by saying, yes, let's create a nonprofit organization?
So this is something we've actually talked to DWP about too, because of how the funding go, and they're right behind you. That's Decolonizing Wealth Project right there. I think that we can partner with nonprofits that will help assist with those tribal governments and those not federally recognized tribes that don't want to go through either the recognition process or through, being a nonprofit basically. And so I think it would be up to that group and even up to this group to think through with our DWP partners, how that would best work, where we have, a trusted partner that helps get that funding out to those communities.
Yeah, and I'm still being educated on this because I know that there have been challenges with, and real concerns with, waiving sovereign immunity or broadly impacting or reducing tribal autonomy around the use of this funding. So, I look to Christina to educate me, but I think we want to work, with not only the Truth and Healing Council, but if we are able to put together an entity to guide this funding to really identify how do we do this? Because, from my perspective, well, I'm very, very open-minded about how this can be done, recognizing that different tribal governments, different tribal communities have different interests, right, and different needs.
Christina, can we get some attention over here? I think Chief Sisk also wants to say something too, but first, I just want to, I'm really excited about this. I think it's great, lovely. Here's the thing, right? We are, for example, in a part of California that is inundated with various communities, some of whom have competing land claims, right? And we're largely unrecognized communities. And this kind of opportunity is wonderful. If in fact there are some kind of clarified and settled boundaries between communities, but I can think of several sites in our region where there would be competing claims. And it's concerning because a lot of us are not actually, we don't have the internal capacity. We don't have attorneys necessarily at the call who can go out and defend, our particular claims and so forth. So it's exciting at the same time that it's very worrisome because some of that land can end up in hands that maybe are not appropriate. And this speaks to a kind of bigger issue that we have in the state with the list, right? With the kind of changing in criteria over decades. It's just a natural function of how things went, right? But 20 years ago, what the criteria for the list list of California Native Americans was not the same as what it is today. So today, I've seen the updated criteria. It looks stronger and so forth. At the same time, it still allows for self-identification of your territory, right? So I know that there are multiple tribes claiming overlapping land, right? And so we kind of need to think about that when we're, putting out these types of policies. There either needs to be a criteria established in the new policy itself that helps identify how those types of conflicts are going to be resolved or are going to be addressed, so that we don't just wake up one day and say, oh, guess what, right? Now that land that you thought was in your ancestral territory is now being acquired, right, by someone else. And then also, of course, it speaks to the need to really, really, really do something about that list. And I know the consultation process is going on with NAHC to make sure that that's kind of revised. But in the interim, if we keep pushing new great policies, potentially great policies forward, we can also end up continuing to harm the tribes, the actual tribes that are legitimate folks with lineal descent and ancestry in the homelands. So just wanted to flag that because it's really concerning to me.
Yeah, I think you raise an excellent point about the complexity of land return when there are multiple tribes, governments, communities that claim that land as ancestral land. And I don't have a quick and easy answer for that. I think that's where we would looking for this input from tribes and ultimately some type of consultative body to help us shape this funding to be able to work through that. Geneva and I and others are addressing an opportunity in far northern California right now with regard to lands that are going to be made available for potential return as a result of the dam removal in the Klamath Basin, which is will be the largest dam removal in American history, led by the Yurok government, the Karuk government, and others. But this is complex because there are multiple tribes that have that as ancestral land. And to your point, those interests and those needs don't necessarily align. So I think that's something we're going to need to unpack, and that needs to be sort of clarity and transparency on how we deal with this before, from my perspective anyways, before those resources get allocated to avoid a situation that the council member referenced.
And I do want to have a quick time check. We have one more comment from Chief Sisk, it looks like, and then we've got some presenters that have some time constraints. So I want to make sure we get into that portion. We'll have Geneva actually work with you during lunch to talk about some of these programs as well. So you can ask more questions at that time, and also give her your comments as she is thinking about how to kind of think through all of this. I think the key point too, before we get to Chief Sisk, is this is something that's going through the legislative and budget process. So if this is something that has broad support, legislature needs to hear it.
Yeah.
Chief Sisk?
Yes, I'm sorry, I'm not in the room with you guys. It's a great opportunity to hear this, that the governor is moving towards this pretty big task. And Wade, you're in the middle of this, and Christina, there's so many things as was mentioned already, but I think that we're on the right path when we're saying we need assistance in helping to identify our tribal entities again. And the list sufficed during the most likely descendant when there weren't any tribal entities moving again. We're rebuilding tribal structures everywhere. And like it was mentioned, is that some of them have popped up as state incorporated groups. And so the problem that I see is that one, the villages need to be built to repopulate the tribes, and then everybody benefits from those villages. But when we're individuals, which the state has since 1850 has kind of broke down the tribal systems or tried to break them down to nothing and install individual rights. So now we have more Indians with individual rights than are concerned with tribal rights or the tribal benefits. But one of the solutions that I had mentioned before and that we are seeking is for the state to do its own recognition of tribal entities and provide assistance for tribes to come back together again. Like I talked to Wade yesterday about the village up here, that we're doing this. There's no mechanism for us to build a village, but we're building a village anyway. And we realized that the county could come in at any time and dismantle the whole thing. We are also on the river working with the salmon return, and because of the river that needs the salmon and all of the water projects. But we're not sitting at the same size chairs at those tables because we're unrecognized. We don't have the same kind of funding or attorneys to investigate the issues that we need to put in certain languages. You know, we have a TIPO office that, you know, we are learning as fast as we can what the laws are. But I think that the first thing is to bring the unrecognized. I mean, this is the elephant in the room, is those unrecognized, disfranchised or disenrolled Indian people who deserve benefits, deserve the minimum benefits that all the other Indians already getting. And I see that, you know, we're not in a position to compete against, let's say, a local tribe here, you know, Redding Rancheria or Yochadihe. We're not in any position to really compete with them for a grant because they have all of the staffing. I mean, if they came to my house and saw our staff and our work facility and how we manage to get to where we're at are now, it wouldn't be the same. I mean, a lot of the unrecognized tribes are working in other houses. You know, one of the reasons I came home is because I can't afford to stay in Sacramento. You know, I wanted to see the people, I wanted to greet the people, I want to be there, but I have tons of things. One of my aunties is moving, she has nowhere to go. So from there, yesterday, we went to her house to help move her. But we don't have the same levels. You know, my kids don't have the same opportunities for schooling. All the unrecognized tribes don't have that. We are now threatened with the healthcare because they're doing away with the California claims case. I think the state should pick that up and look at our rights that was given through the courts. So I'm going to leave it right there, but I am excited about the possibilities that, you know, we can correct some of these things. And if it is a down payment, then maybe we can get to some of these other things too. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Secretary.
Yeah, thank you. Appreciate it.
And he'll just be down the hall if anyone needs to bug him later too.
That's the one on the left.
Good to know.
So thank you all, really wonderful engagement. And again, we have Assistant Secretary Thompson here, who's going to be available to walk you through some of these things at lunchtime as well. We're gonna do a quick roll call and then we have our first presenter for all of you today. So we will just go very quickly. Councilmember Khan is not here. Councilmember Kessler Mata.
Present.
Councilmember Macaro.
Right here.
Councilmember Manzano. Do we have her? No? Okay. You're gonna have to speak up because we can't see you nodding. Councilmember Burris.
Here.
Councilmember Perone is not here. Councilmember Sisk.
Here.
Councilmember Roberts is not here. Councilmember Horkes.
Present.
Councilmember Harper. Here. Councilmember Myers.
Either.
And Councilmember Giovanetti is not here. Councilmember Elliott Santos.
Here.
Councilmember Lucas.
Here.
Councilmember Turner.
Not here.
No. And Councilmember Phelps.
Here.
We have established quorum, and Loretta, I'm going to ask you for your help in moderating our presenters, just because I don't have the same setup in this room.
All right. Well, this next portion of our agenda, we have a panel on the Native history of Sacramento and different tribal initiatives. And James, if you could elevate the panelists. So the first speaker we have today for you all is Dr. Rose Sosa Warsoldier, and she's an assistant professor at CSU Sacramento. And James does, she also has that PowerPoint.
Second, I'm promoting our panelists now. And I'll bring up our PowerPoint now too.
And while we're bringing the PowerPoint up, I'll quickly go through our other panelists as well. We also have Virginia Hendrick, who is the Executive Director of California Consortium of Urban Indian Health, and the Honorable Christine Williams, who is Chief Judge at Wilton Rancheria Tribal Court. And then we will also hear from Wilton Rancheria.
Okay, give me a second and I'll get this PowerPoint up.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, everyone. It's great to be here. So I was invited to talk about specifically looking at the memorials and statues that were removed in the greater sort of Sacramento area. And so I'm going to, we're sort of hybrid, right? So I'll be saying next slide to indicate to go on to the next slide. But I entitled this Notions of Nostalgia because when you're dealing with history and sort of the idea of public memory, it really is this idea of nostalgia. And to really keep in mind and think about what psychologists term cognitive dissonance, this idea that when people are introduced with information that really confronts what they've always held to be true, notions that they've always believed to be true, that they attempt to make any type of rationalization to pivot and not to have that discussion, not to acknowledge that this is perhaps historically accurate information. And this very much I want people to keep in mind when we're talking about the ideas of statues and memorials, and really the way that not only the historical narrative works, but also the way that public narrative and public history, how that functions and what its purpose is. So carved in stone, cast in bronze, monuments, memorials, statues and plaques play a role in the way regional and national memory functions. In part, history investigates the way memory forms, persuades, and maintains knowledge, and exalts certain individuals or commemorates specific events. Public memorials, monuments, and statues often serve as ideological tools of white supremacy and oppression. These symbols and stories are often both the product of and perpetuators from a one-dimensional imagined past. The construction is purposely designed to last generations and instill respect and idolatry of events and individuals classified as heroes. Authority is implied in these public displays of memory, and as implied permanence generally goes unquestioned, while imparting a sense of pride and empathy about these individuals and their stories. However, if you remove scheduled maintenance, these sturdy, unquestioned items may become worn, crumble, and fade. They are not permanent. They are maintained. Next slide, please. And so when you think about really the last couple of years, a lot of national focus has been on the memorials for the Confederacy, but specifically to California, we are all aware, right, that a lot of the items that were removed either by citizen force or by voluntary means included Christopher Columbus, Hunahpu Serra, and also John Sutter. And to really sort of think about, right, what is going on, that not only were these built in the first place, and to think about the time that they were built and what is that revealing, but then also to sort of think about what were a lot of the public sort of pushbacks when these were removed. And so to really, consider, there's been a lot of attention for the last, couple of years, but really a lot of these statues in particular have been protested against by Native folks actually for decades. And it's only in sort of recent history that there have been some movement, and I'll talk about specific legislation towards the end of the presentation. Next slide, please. And so these really quickly are just a handful of images of missions in California. And so you can sort of see based on this that these are really sort of the early 20th century, really the late 19th century. And I show these to really sort of demonstrate the idea that the missions were actually all crumbling. They were falling apart. They were not inhabitable. In large part, when you look at sort of the middle part of the 20th century, it was the result of coordinated efforts of chambers of commerce and booster organizations that led to funding the missions for them to be restored. And it was largely motivated out of belief that they could market them as tourism locations. And most of us that have visited missions, whether or not we have ancestors who were held in those missions, right? When you walk onto the mission grounds, you can very clearly see the marketability, right? The economic engine that is built into the missions. But I show this to demonstrate, right, that that was not always the case. Next slide, please. And so in this, you see Sutter's Fort. And to really sort of think about who was John Sutter, what did he symbolize? And so you see on the slide itself, so that's an early drawing of Sutter's Fort. And to really sort of think about, right, so Sutter came to what became California. He ultimately became a Mexican citizen. He received over 150,000 acres of land as a land grant from Mexico. Ultimately, you know, his son sold a lot of that land grant to what Sacramento ultimately was built upon. And to really kind of think about the image of John Sutter, how he is viewed. And I really want to highlight a quote from one of my mentors from graduate school. So Dakota historian Waziatuan details the need for truth telling. And she indicates using accurate words to describe events and policies. So using terms like genocide is the only way that you can describe what happened. And she knows that this is important because, quote, if the settler society denies the injustices of the past and the present, then the impetus to maintain the status quo is strong. There is no recognized need for change. And to really sort of think about how perhaps you can see this going on with Sutter's Fort. Next slide, please. And how there has been change. So I want to draw your attention that Sutter's Fort and the California State Parks for the past several years have been looking at reevaluating how the narrative of John Sutter is presented to the public, also to consider how to include Native voices, to include Native histories, to include Native stories. And they actually have a couple of public workshops. If you are unable to attend any of those workshops, they also have a survey that is online where they are seeking public input. And so the photograph on the left, that's actually from, I think it's 1867. And again, you can sort of see, so this was the main building of Sutter's Fort and how it is very much decayed, right? This was not always how we see it now. And to really bring people's attention to that idea, right? This is a created past. On the right, that's a photograph from the centennial celebration. And so you see in this a number of women, and so they're dressed in Swiss costumes to sort of commemorate Sutter's Fort and its founding. Next slide, please. And so to really keep in mind that there has been a fairly long history of monuments and statues and memorials being removed throughout California. So I'm only going to highlight a couple of them. There are more than this though. So first in 2018, what was known as the Early Days statue, so this was located in San Francisco, was removed. And so this was actually done by a vote. So you see a Native person who is dressed in plain style attire. You have a Catholic priest who is standing above them, and you also have a Mexican vaquero. And so it was determined that this actually was not fit to be sort of in before the public without context. And so it was removed by the City Art Council through a vote. And so it's in storage right now. Next slide, please. So in June of 2020, some of you might recall this. So an 8-foot tall Sutter statue that stood outside the Sutter Medical Center, which had been donated by the United Swiss Lodge of California only in 1987, had been located at the 28th and L Streets. this was removed, and this was removed after the previous week it had been found with red paint on it. And so this is something that you actually see very commonly, that there are a series of sort of petty vandalisms that occur sometimes. And as a result, whether it's a hospital, whether it is indeed even a mission itself, in this instance of Ventura, that had a statue of Sarah. So the city council voted to remove it. And so again, to kind of think about what is going on, right? What is sort of not only the purpose of it being built in the first place, but then also to consider what was the conversation when it was removed. Next slide, please. And so in Juneteenth of 2020, so you have, again, another statue. This was at Golden Gate Park. So this was brought down by force. And so Karina Gould, her comment to the media was, quote, "It's about time." And when this was done, specifically at the Golden Gate Park, and there was another removal at another location, I can't recall off the top of my head, and some of the Catholic bishops in the state of California publicly asserted that this was the result of, quote, evil, and actually held an exorcism, and sort of correlating that any type of protest, any type of raising of conversation or discussion, not just necessarily sort of the idea of perhaps petty vandalism, but raising this as an issue of discussion was really a call of evil. And again, to kind of think about, right, what is going on in that very public conversation. Next slide, please. And then, of course, you have the Capitol grounds. And so this was the statue of Sarah, and it was established and built in 1967. So it stood for a very long time. Actually, it was the result of California state legislation and, in addition, funding by the state of California to partially help build it and maintain it. So this was also brought down by force. And so on the left, you have a quote from Chairperson Jesus Tarango from Wilton. And so there was very much a public conversation about what does it mean that there was a statue of Sarah on the Capitol grounds? What does it mean that this actually was funded by the state of California? What does it mean that when you would go to the Capitol grounds, you don't actually see a lot of imagery that actually depicts Native people, Native cultures, that's largely absent. And so to really sort of think about that, these symbols and iconography, right? It's a battle over history and symbols to a degree. It certainly is about the past. This was built in 1967, but also to consider that perhaps more importantly, this actually is extremely futuristic because it is the idea of how it relates to a time in the future wherein there are not necessarily public exaltations of individuals like Sarah, right? Colonizers are not going to be celebrated. That doesn't mean that they will not be forgotten, right? But perhaps in this instance, there actually won't be a state-backed celebration of Sarah. Next slide, please. And so you have then ultimately Assemblymember Ramos. So he proposed, and what was passed was AB 338. And so this was required because the Sarah statue at the Capitol grounds was designed through California state legislation. It required a California legislative act to actually formally remove it. And you also have 6 tribal nations from the sort of greater Sacramento area that served as co-sponsors to this legislation, ultimately with the agreement that there would be a design that would be set forth. And of course, there is a process and a policy to it, but that would celebrate California Native people on the Capitol grounds. And so this actually passed in a bipartisan fashion. It was not unanimous. There was some public pushback about this. And you have in this photograph, so you have Sarah, and those of you who can sort of see it a little closely, you might recognize some folks who, so this was an event that Ramos and his staff put together, inviting California Native people to come together in celebration of really sort of commemorating this legislation. And Governor Newsom signed this legislation into law on California Indian Day of last year. And so it will be a lengthy process, but I would also like to point out to folks that this certainly is, right, so Sarah's statue is formally removed. There is going to be a process to install a statue or some type of public art to commemorate California Indian people, but I want to also be very clear that it does not have any funding from the state of California, in contrast to the original Sarah statue, which had $30,000 from the state of California that was invested into it. This is all going to be the result of collaboration and funding from a number of the local tribal nations. And I think it's also significant to point out that difference in the way in which commemoration, at least on the Capitol grounds, has functioned. Next slide, please.
And Doctor, we have a raised hand from one of the council members.
Yes.
Yeah, I didn't want to interrupt the flow. I just wanted to, I can hold to the end, and if that's fine. Are we good? Or I'm fine asking now as well.
I think go ahead and ask now.
Go ahead.
Okay. The question I have, let me put that down so it's not confusing. The question I have is, in the wake of statues coming down, and I guess I'm speaking from what I've been aware of across the country, especially in the South, where Confederate heroes and icons, their statues have come down. But there's also been some in the Midwest, I think some notable ones in Minnesota, for instance. And you know, this discussion, there's two discussions that I've heard of, and I'm wondering if your research and studies what they say about this, but and it's really up to us in the end. So it's somewhat of an academic question, but if you remove these statues, these icons, which I wholeheartedly agree with, you know, the ones that, and how they come down is also important as well, you know, because there is so much pent up anger and hurt. And, you know, to me, it's a natural part of the process that while Father Sarah may not be here, the physical representation of him and his spirit is there, and people have a right to attack it, as they do any other building, I suppose, if they want that kind of demonstration. So, but in the process of bringing a statue down, or maybe, you know, the state or a county, for instance, brings down a statue, what do you do with it? I mean, there's a line, it's not really an argument maybe, but there's a line of discussion that says, well, let's not destroy it. Let's put it in a repository out of sight, cover it with a sheet or put it in a box or whatever, maybe even like a coffin. And it's still there if you need it for an object lesson through time. But once you destroy it completely, it's no longer there for the object lesson of, look, see, this is what we were talking about. Of course, there's plenty of photographs, and in modern days here, there's plenty of video. So, but is there something on point that you have or have come across in terms of where that comes in the process? Is there a suggestion that it's a best practice that should be something we look at doing, is to the extent that hasn't been destroyed already? Go ahead and preserve it. I know what the state historians would say. Yeah, we need to keep all this stuff. And based on what I saw yesterday, I mean, there are chairs from rail cars that are being stored in an inventory, in a repository. So, you know, I would think they'd probably think a statue of somebody's icon like that would be important. So that's kind of my question. Thank you.
Right. Yeah, I appreciate the question. So there's really a range in the response. So in the instance of, so for example, what's showing right now, so this was the statue of Isabella and Columbus. So this was removed from the rotunda, right? And so what ultimately sort of part of the discussion has been.
I didn't know that, by the way. Thanks for it's been over 2 years since I've been in the building.
Oh, yeah.
And it was always appalling that was there to begin with. And
yeah.
It's such a prominent place in the Capitol. So anyway, thanks for informing. That just made my day. Thank you.
that was removed in July of 2020, and ultimately part of what the discussion, because it was a gift by a banker who actually gained most of his monetary wealth during the gold rush. And of course, we are all, I think, well versed in sort of the ways in which specific individuals and families were able to gain massive amounts of wealth during the gold rush. And that very much is, related to genocide and related to mass death. And in this instance, what has been discussed by the state is whether or not this would be returned to the descendants of his family. Now, this is multiple tons of granite and marble. And so I'm not sure how far along that discussion is with the family. But in the instance of some other municipalities, what they've done is either put them in storage or they've placed them in museums where there can be better context. Part of what really, I think, the outrage about a number of these sort of public displays is not only sort of that you are exalting a specific individual as perhaps a hero, but at the same time, you don't learn the complete story or the complete picture of them from sort of looking at, a 2-ton statue. You don't learn the story of Columbus. But if it's placed in a museum, and whether it is the docents or whether it is contextualized within a very context of plaques, right? You can add context to it. So there have been several different instances, but there's not a surefire sort of one size fits all. And a lot of the municipalities are in conversation about what to do with these. So I have to wrap up. So I just have, I think, a couple more slides.
Well, hearing your answer, although it dawns on me that after hearing the governor this morning, whatever we decide is going to matter. And if we decide in the context here that these things either need to be destroyed or saved in a repository or whatever, something in between, that's what should happen, because our charge as council members, as a council, is to enumerate the grievances and set us on the path to healing. And if part of that healing is the destruction of these statues, well, then that needs to be what happens. So thank you.
Thank you. Next slide. I just have a couple more slides remaining. So again, lastly, just to sort of keep in mind that most of the monuments and the statues are actually relatively new in California. So they're roughly within the last 30 to 50 years in a state that is over 170 years old. And so again, to kind of reflect and think about the idea of what does it mean that these individuals are being exalted, while at the same time, the contemporaries from their time periods did not feel any type of compulsion, for example, to build any type of monument to Sutter. To also sort of think about how this further, questions about sort of whose voices and memories and stories and narratives are being remembered or oppressed when you're talking about the broader historical narrative. Some critics might say that this is sort of cancel culture, and I want to be very clear. The removal of these is not reflective of cancel culture. It's also not reflective of sort of revisionism gone awry. This is actually a historical correction. What actually is representative of revision is to build these monuments to these individuals and highlight a couple of instances and only focus on that without sort of the context of their entirety of their story, and also the very lived impact that they had on California Native people. Next slide. And so again, just to sort of consider that removing these statues does not translate into these individuals being lost to history, that this is actually about eliminating public exaltation, placing them within historical context, recognizing the revisionist history that came before. And so I'll just end with a quote by Morningstar Ghali. So she's Pitt River, and so she was interviewed about the removal of statues, and so her quote was, "These are monuments to racism. These are monuments to genocide, and it's time for them to come down." Next slide. And thank you.
And thank you so much, Dr. Sosa Warsolger. And I just really want to acknowledge our panelists and the timing constraints and how thankful we are for flexibility. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Virginia Hendrick.
Squanicoy, Aiqui, Naknau, Virginia, Hedrick. Good morning. Nice to see your faces again. It was wonderful to join many of you in person yesterday. I don't have slides and I can keep this brief, and always appreciate hearing from Dr. Souza War Soldier. She's just so brilliant. So I was asked today to talk about sort of the history of healthcare in the Sacramento Valley. I'm the executive director for the California Consortium for Urban Indian Health, and we work on behalf of 10 IHS-funded urban Indian organizations and sort of California, some of California's largest cities, including 2 residential treatment facilities, the Friendship House in San Francisco and Native Directions in Manteca, which are designated as urban Indian organizations. I want to talk a little bit about the history of healthcare in Sacramento and start with, first, I want to acknowledge that what predates the Indian Health Service is our own modalities of traditional healing and healing through ceremony, both group ceremony and individual ceremony. The use of traditional healers is something that predates contact and has continued through time, and that we're actually seeing becoming a part of some of our institutions and our Indian health programs. In the Sacramento Valley, like in the larger region, in downtown, we have the Sacramento Native American Health Center. I'll talk a little bit about the history of SNAC. I served on the board there for 3 years. And then in the region, we also have the Northern Valley Indian Health, to our north, Chappaday Indian Health Program, and Shingle Springs Tribal Health in the larger region. I'll talk a little bit about the differences. So in urban Indian organizations such as SNAC, we get our operational authority from the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. Tribes and tribal health programs offer Indian health through ISDEA, through the Indian Self-Determination Education and Assistance Act. And that actually has a lot to do with funding and the way that we operate, how we can provide services, and in many ways how we can't provide services. It's also really important to talk about the larger perspective of the Indian healthcare delivery system in California and its gross underfunding. I want to acknowledge that there's sort of a landmark case that the Rincon Band of Mission Indians won in 1979, Rincon versus the United States, in really highlighting the gross underfunding of California and our Indian health programs. They won that case, and they won again in an appeal in 1980, affirming that California is not receiving adequate funding to deliver healthcare services for the population in California. There are over 8,000 employees of the Indian Health Service. Only 45 are here in California, just to give you a little bit of perspective. We have no IHS hospital. Some of you might remember that there was an IHS hospital on the Hoopa Reservation, actually. It closed just the year before I was born. And is no longer an IHS funded hospital, and there are no other IHS hospitals, nor there have ever been another IHS hospital. In California, California tribes operate tribal health programs, largely based on consortia, because their single contracts would not be large enough for many to operate their own health facility. And so you see 501c3 nonprofit tribal health programs governed in association with tribes in California. The Sacramento Native American Health Center was, its predecessor was called the Sacramento Urban Indian Health Program. And many of us in the Sacramento region know that facility as being referred to as SUPI. And SUPI was established in 1974. Around the same time, nationally and throughout California, we were seeing the development of both tribal health programs and urban Indian health programs. Urban Indian health programs were really based out of a couple of things. One, really acknowledging the federally sponsored relocation of American Indian people from other states and other large land-based reservations to California's largest cities like Los Angeles, Oakland, and San Francisco. And so the establishment of urban Indian organizations was a recognition that the federal trust responsibility doesn't end at the reservation border. I noted to you the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act, because the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act has really incredible language as it defines who are American Indian people that would be eligible for IHS services. And in fact, Section 1679 of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act talks about the eligibility of California Indians. It says that the following California Indians shall be eligible for health services provided by Indian Health Service: any member of a federally recognized tribe, any descendant of an Indian who was residing in California on June 1st, 1852, if such descendant is a member of an Indian community served by a local program of the IHS and is regarded as an Indian by the community in which its descendants live. Any Indian who holds trust interest in public domain, national forests, reservation allotments, or entitlements. Any California Indian who is listed in the plans for distribution of assets of rancherias and reservations located within the state of California under the Act of August 18th, 1958, and any descendant of such Indian. When we talk about the Indian healthcare delivery system in California, we talk about federally recognized IHS eligibles as being members of federally recognized tribes, their descendants to the first degree. Urban Indian organizations also have a caveat that we can serve descendants to the second degree. So that would be the grandchild of a member of a federally recognized tribe and what is noted as California Indians. And if you ever ask our local California area office to give you a breakdown, they will tell you how many Indians meet those definitions. Urban Indian organizations, the last time I checked the data was about 5 years ago, serve about 7,000 members of California tribes and those who meet the definition of California Indian. So SUPI was in business and ran as an urban Indian organization from 1974 to 2004 until it closed its doors. We would go in Sacramento about 10 months without having an urban Indian or having a health center locally. In 2005, the Native American Health Center of Oakland and San Francisco would extend its IHS contract to the Sacramento region and reopen a health facility offering medical and dental services. In 2006, under the leadership of several local community leaders, including Lorenda Sanchez of California Indian Manpower Consortium and Matt Franklin, would then establish the Sacramento Native American Health Center as we know it today. Currently, they offer one facility at 2020 J Street, and likely by the end of this year, we'll be opening a new facility in South Sacramento where we do have a large growing population of American Indian people. They offer medical, dental, optometry, chiropractic. They also offer a traditional healing service through a local American Indian woman, Sage Lapina, who offers traditional healing services through local herbal medicine and does plant walks and can be referred to patients much like you might be referred to a specialist. Sacramento Native American Health Center is also hiring for a chief traditional health officer who will really lead the work of building out traditional health services that are offered through the facility. And I want to note that SNAC is not the first and won't be the last Indian health program in California to build out access to traditional healing services in this way. I think I've covered all the points I wanted to, and I know we're behind, so I'm just trying to get us back on track. Happy to take any questions if there are any. Yes, I see you, Chairman Macaro. But you're on mute.
Just a quick comment. It's the it was in, I think, 1948, late 1940s, right after World War II, when the last Indian Health Hospital in Southern California closed. And there hasn't been one since then in the South. So either way, it's pretty paltry.
No, thanks for noting that. And I should add that we do have recently, like in the last decade, 2 IHS operating facilities that are IHS sort of not just funded, but operated by federal employees of the Indian Health Service. And they are youth regional treatment facilities, one in Hemet, California, and one just outside of Davis. And I want to note that in the last sort of 15 years that I've been working in this arena, as California tribes and tribal leaders were able to assert to the agency what their top priority would be in terms of establishing any new facility in California. The priority was really focused on youth and addressing youth substance use disorder and the very high rate of suicide that we experience in our communities. And so it's really notable that those are the 2 areas that the tribal leaders decided to focus and ask the agency to spend resources and build facilities were to build youth regional treatment facilities. And Chairwoman Chief Kayleen Sisk, I see your hand up as well.
Thank you. Great information. During those times of the health care programs, and especially when they shut down the hospital in Hoopaw, there was a lot of turmoil happening during that time where they moved the offices out of Hoopaw overnight, over weekend, and opened up in Redding. And IHSS got rid of all of its unrecognized tribal people on the boards. And then there was a crib program that continued to offer some services to the unrecognized people, but there was a period of time where unrecognized people were without health services for a very long time. And these projects that are around us do minimal health care. We have gotten better response as the Winnemem Wintu tribal people. And in fact, SNAC has a list of our tribal members. If we can't get the services we need here, we will travel all the way to Sacramento to get that help. That has to change. What's your scope on like getting us the local hospital even? I mean,
you're asking a really complicated question, and I can't answer it. I'm going to do my best to stay within the lanes. So it is true that urban Indian organizations, I said to you that we operate on 2 different federal authorities. So there's the ISDIA, which is what we sort of refer to as 638 clinics in California. And then there are UIOs, urban Indian organizations, and we operate under the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act. So tribal health programs that are operating a 638 contract maintain the right of tribal sovereignty to determine eligibility for who they provide services, and with very limited resources. So tribal health programs, because we don't have an IHS hospital, we must rely on what is known as purchase and referred care for all care that has to, where people receive services out of the clinic. Urban Indian organizations don't even have access to purchase and referred care. In fact, we make up less than 1% of the entire IHS budget, despite the fact that about 70% of American Indians live in an urban area, and that's about 90% in California. I digress. So tribal health programs, I just want to know, are extremely underfunded, and they do and can and often do set eligibility requirements for who will receive services within their facility. There's also a few other things. So the federal government mandates that Indian Health Service be what is known as the payer of last resort. And so every Indian health program must exhaust all resources to pay for an American Indian person's visit to their facility before they can sort of bill it to IHS or to the IHS contract. So there are a number of things that sort of complicate when an American Indian person presents at an Indian health program, whether and how they'll be eligible for services. And boards of directors also dictate that. And, Chief Sisk, I want to note that no bias here. Maybe there's a natural bias to SNAC because, I'd formerly served on the board and represent the agency at a policy and advocacy level. But many of our urban Indian organizations do go to great lengths to extend services to non-federally recognized American Indians and really highlight that section of the Indian Healthcare Improvement Act that applies to both tribal and urban Indian agencies. So thank you for highlighting that because I think it's something we don't talk enough about.
Yeah.
And it's my entire job to talk about sort of the role of urban Indian organizations and the services that we provide.
Yeah, that's the part about it, is that not enough even California Indians realize the differences of healthcare that's offered to us. And a lot of my members are like, oh yeah, they did this, but they won't do a sonogram. Oh, you need a sonogram. They won't do the sonogram, but they'll do a sonogram for their tribal member, but they won't do it for us. And they'll do a sonogram for a spouse of a tribal member who is not Indian at all, but they won't do it for us. That's the inequities that I'm referring to, is that something needs to happen so that California Indians, who are definitely dancers and singers and putting their feet on the ground, saving the world with salmon, should have equitable healthcare. Thank you.
Yep, I agree. And I think there's some solutions. I think restoration of the state Indian health program, you heard me say it yesterday, and I'll just keep saying it. It was redlined in 2009 under Governor Schwarzenegger and is slated for restoration under Governor Newsom this year for one-time funding at 12 million. Really, an equitable amount would have been 23 million, and ongoing funding. We all know that one-time funding isn't going to solve all of the problems and might allow Indian health programs some flexibility in how they provide services, and historically did provide flexibility.
Yeah, and to recognize and to certify the lists of Indian people, not tribal in the sense, because that's been destroyed to a big degree, and that we're sitting here with rancherias as tribes and in the middle of a tribal area, and the tribal people of the area are left off. And so those reconciliations and justices have to change for the healthcare to change too.
Yeah, I'll just take one side note to say that I'm a member of the Yurok tribe, a federally recognized tribe. My spouse is a member of a incorrectly terminated tribe, Taylorsville Rancheria. And despite my children being eligible for enrollment with the Yurok tribe, we have them enrolled with Taylorsville Rancheria. And so I deeply understand the complexities and often take deep dives into this federally recognized status and non-federally recognized status and sort of how we choose to identify.
Any questions in the room?
With that, I really want to thank Virginia for presenting today.
Yes, thank you. And I have to exit for another meeting.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. We really appreciate it. Our
Okay.
next presenter is Judge Christine Williams, and she is currently serving as Chief Judge of the Wilton Rancheria.
Hello, thank you so much. Thank you everyone for having me here today. Really appreciate it. And I've really enjoyed the presentations so far. I've learned a lot. So I'm going to try to stay within my kind of area of expertise, which is, I would say at this point, justice-related issues here in California. So my name's Christine Williams. I am a member of the Yurok tribe, which is in Northern California. And I'm also serving as the chief judge for the Wilton Rancheria Tribal Court. And I've been working in the areas of Indian law for over 20 years and been serving as a judge for tribes in California for over 10 years. I am a newly appointed judge for the Wilton Rancheria and the first judge, as the Wilton tribe will talk to you more about, I'm sure, in the next presentation. They are a terminated tribe who are now federally recognized. And so they're reestablishing a lot of their systems, including their justice system. So I'm honored to have that role and honored to do the work that I do for other tribes throughout California Indian country. So I have a PowerPoint, but I didn't get it in on time, so I'm going to follow it myself. But I apologize for not having anything for you to look at other than me, but we'll get through it. So I wanted to sort of frame the conversation a little bit, going a little outside of my expertise as a judge and an attorney, talking about Indian identity, because I think that's really going to be at the core of what the commission is dealing with. And I can already see that there's a lot of push between the different groups that are going to be represented and what that really means going forward for you all as a commission. Big, tough job ahead of you. So I do want to acknowledge all of you for the work that you've undertaken. Some of you, this probably is work you're doing out of the goodness of your heart, unpaid, volunteer. So for all of you that are there representing all of us in California, thank you very much for your dedication. I always kind of look at Indian identity as having three major parts. There's political, and then there's cultural, and then there's the racial ethnic part. And if you really think about that, it's sort of the same when you look at our tribal identity as a state of California. There's political aspects, there's cultural aspects, and then there's racial ethnic aspects. And so the political side, are you from a recognized tribe? Are you from an unrecognized tribe? Are you a member of your recognized or unrecognized tribe? Or are you a lineal descendant who does not meet the qualifications for membership of your own tribe? Political entity in and of itself is complex and means different things for different people. Then we look at cultural. How culturally connected are you? Who decides? Do you speak your tribe's language? Does anyone in your tribe speak their language? Does that make you less Indian or more Indian than someone else? Is it comparative? Is that how we decide? So, do you participate in your dances, or was your family removed from the tribal area long ago? There's so many things that go into cultural identity in California, and that it's really specific to each individual and specific to each tribe, and then specific too to like looking across our state. I'm sure those of you who are tribal members from California tribes know the feeling of being stereotyped, not just as being like Plains Indians, which are nowhere near us, but then even to be, assumed that you're from a tribe in California that's different from yours. I've gone to give presentations to the fourth graders because a lot of you who grew up in California know that's when they sort of start talking about tribal people in California. I mean, kind of, and I always try to get out in front of it so that my kids don't come home with a paper headdress with like feathers glued to it. So I go in and inevitably someone will say, but, oh, you're rock, but I think they were camping. They did a lot of, they lived in things, they look kind of like teepees. I'm like, no, they know it's dugout houses, wooden, made of a lot of redwood. Well, weren't they had Thule. I'm like, no, we're talking Central. And then getting into culture. What were your songs sort of like the bird songs? I'm like, in Southern California? I mean, we traveled, but come on. So it's really, culturally, we're a very diverse state just within the borders of California. And then to think about the racial ethnic component, which is that, what about the people who are culturally connected, grew up in the communities for many, many years, maybe even were adopted by our tribes, but don't have any racial or ethnic ties to those communities? And what about the opposite? What about the people that have a large blood quantum from a tribe in California, but they grew up completely away from their tribe? They were disconnected from their tribe either through the preservation of their own family, maybe through adoption. Maybe they were adopted out, but they're still racially and ethnically tied to California's tribal people. So basically my point is it's a very complex thing to talk about identity as a tribal person in the state of California. And someone earlier said the term, the elephant in the room, and we all know what that means. It means the big thing that, we don't really talk about, but everybody kind of knows that it's there. And one of those in California, in my opinion, is the fact that we have a large number of people from tribes outside of California, and that they really make up a big part of what is our tribal community in California, and they have for a very long time. So when does history start? And when do we start acknowledging, the fact that our complex weave, if you will, of what makes up our tribal identity in California has basket threads from outside of our own state, and they influence that in really positive, diverse ways. So basically, all of these components are really complex and they're indivisible. You have to look at them all together, which is no small feat. And it's important to remember that sovereignty and sovereign identity really comes from within. And so we talk about federal recognition, and that's an external factor. That's something that the federal government has created and controls and decides. But you can't ignore it. Federal acknowledgement is a real thing, and it does set our tribes apart from each other in terms of status, especially with the federal government, which translates a lot of times to funding. And we just can't ignore that funding is necessary. It's a resource that really changes what a tribe can do and is able to provide for their own people. We look at things too, like the US Department of the Interior Certificate of Degree of Indian Blood. I mean, some of us have a pedigree being tracked like if we were some sort of a show animal. So those things are external, but they do affect our identity as individuals, our identity as tribes, and our identity as a community as a whole in California. And then we have to look to it like the passage of time, because again, I go into those fourth grade classes and they really want to talk about, things that happened prior to European contact. And that's okay, that's important, that's our history. But at the same time, people evolve, all people have always evolved. And sometimes when we look at acknowledging history, it's done in a way to try to keep us all trapped in the past. And that is to say that Native people can't really evolve. And so that you're not still, living in some sort of past that doesn't exist anymore, then you're getting erased as being a Native person. And that's, something we have to sort of also consider is not just honoring the past, but also looking at where are we all wanting to go in our future. So for California Indian Country, just want to point out, and for those of you who may not know, although most of you probably do, if you look at across the nation, there's close to 600 tribes in America at this point. But over 100 of those federally recognized tribes are here in California today. And then, as I stated, a lot of our tribal nations in California are not federally recognized. And then we also have, I believe last time I checked, and the data is always a little bit old from the US Census, but California is home to the second highest number of Native people compared with other states, which is quite a lot. And we have to think about the fact that a lot of those people, probably the majority, are from tribes that are outside of California. So that's a pretty diverse landscape when you look at identity here in, what's called Indian country in California. And from a data perspective, even though we have so many people compared to other states that are Native that are living in California, in terms of the California population, still a very small percentage of that overall population, which leads to that feeling of invisibility. And I don't know if those of you who are tribal members in California feel it, but I definitely have felt it growing up and still do, just sort of being left off of data when it's being mentioned, being incorrectly, cited to in terms of data, and then having, at best, we'll get sort of a Native American, but not knowing what tribes are these people from, and are they from the North or the South? Are they from tribes in California, outside of California? So all of that just sort of leads to this invisible minority status that we still sort of occupy here in California. And then I do want to remind everybody that at one point, California was completely occupied, used, and enjoyed. And I use those terms because they come from a historic law case that was sort of how you could determine if there was really any legal claim to land, was it being occupied, used, and enjoyed. So I use those terms. But at one time, Native people were everywhere. We occupied all of the territory within California. But if you look at where just the federally recognized tribes are located today, it's notable that between the counties of, I believe it's Orange County, all the way up through Marin, along the coast of California, there's only one federally recognized tribe along that whole coast. And so just as a funny side note, I mean, it's sort of funny, you got to laugh or we'll all go crazy because this is heavy stuff. But when I gave this presentation one time to some social workers as part of an Indian Child Welfare Act training, one of them asked me afterwards, why didn't the Native people want to live along the coast? It's so beautiful. And so I realized I had to be more specific when I was giving my presentation. I'm like, oh no, we lived along the coast. We just don't have any of that land in trust right now. And they were like, oh, why do you think that is? I was like, we should maybe go to lunch. I have a lot of thoughts on why that is. So, it's just something I think we all know and take for granted. But for someone who doesn't know the background, the history of California, maybe they didn't grow up here, they might look at a map of where there's federally recognized tribes and wonder, like, why was there a mass exodus from the coast of California by the Native tribes? Yeah, well, there was not, and it was complicated. So just getting back to my kind of area of expertise, tribal sovereignty, laws, justice systems, just want to remind everyone, from time immemorial, there's been inherent sovereignty. It's not given by anyone, but it's been slowly eroded over time through federal and state intervention. And so if we're looking at where we are today, and I can skip some of the history because it was covered brilliantly earlier by Dr. Sosa, war soldier. So, but it is important to look at that history, the missions, the untold story of the missions. When gold was discovered and the huge loss of life through our Native people, the reduction in our populations through both mass murders and genocidal acts, and also the introduction of foreign diseases, which claimed a lot of our Native people's lives. And then moving forward into, near statehood time, when the federal government actually came and negotiated 18 treaties, reserving over 8 million acres. Makes me feel like we're maybe starting to come full circle from that a little when I hear a number like 6 million acres being reserved through the Natural Resources Department, that some of that could be potentially used to restore Native practices and Native communities. And then looking at early California policy toward Native people, right as the state was establishing itself and then continuing for many, many years, laws were passed in California allowing for indentured servitude, which is a nice way of saying slavery of Indian men and women and children. Thousands of children were taken as slave laborers. Often their parents were killed in order to make that happen. And the laws didn't allow for Native people to speak out in court, speak on their own behalf, or have any voice. In fact, legally, we weren't even considered citizens or a people. And so the justice system's interactions with Native people in California has traditionally not been good. That being said, I do have a lot of great partnerships now, but there's still work to be done. And I do want to mention the 1950s, 60s, 70s relocation program, where the federal government strategically, intentionally, and through funded sources sent people from outside of California, tribes all around the United States, to come and live in urban areas in our state, in California. And it was a one-way ticket. Those people, if they wanted to return home, had to find their own way, and were not financially able to do that many times. And so we do see that the effects of the relocation program still playing out here today, where there are a lot of people that were transplanted to our state from tribes outside of California. And that was no accident. And then looking at today, I just want to make sure everybody's clear. And I did go to law school and studied Indian law for 3 years, so I'm not going to try to tell you everything I learned in those 3 years, but looking at tribal jurisdiction, which is, if everyone's doing one ask in their presentation, mine would definitely be about, let's talk about sovereignty, let's talk about justice, and let's talk about jurisdiction. So Congress has passed a lot of laws limiting tribal jurisdiction and granting that jurisdiction over to other entities, the federal government, and then in some cases, the state government. So here in California, we're most notably looking at in 1953, Congress transferred jurisdiction that in other states has been granted to the federal government over a lot of criminal jurisdiction to the state of California. And that's Public Law 280. And most tribal people probably don't get, very far in their education from their families without hearing the words Public Law 280. Huge impact on the jurisdiction we have here. When that was all passed, tribes were not consulted. And so these limitations are paternalistic at best, but really more likely racist. They were really predicated on the fact that tribes just didn't have the sophistication, the civility to handle justice systems themselves, and an intervention was needed in order to prevent injustice, which to most of us probably sounds ironic. Where are we now? Currently, right now, as of 2021, tribes still do not have complete jurisdiction within their own boundaries because there's still a belief that tribal courts are not fit to exercise complete jurisdiction over non-Indians, for example, not fit to exercise complete jurisdiction over all types of crimes. Serious crimes, we're not deemed to be able to have the sophistication and the wherewithal to be able to handle those crimes ourselves. And those beliefs that are still being held, still being practiced, that we're all still living by today, they result in inequities in support of our tribal courts, of our tribal jurisdictions, and in particular funding. Here in California, it's presumed that state justice systems are doing enough, that they're handling all of our justice needs. And I can tell you for a fact that that is not true. Tribal justice systems are necessary, that they are underfunded horribly, and that across the nation we have funding issues for justice systems. But in California, I don't know if everyone knows, we don't receive the same allotment of funding from the federal government that other tribes outside of non-Law 280 states, that they receive from the federal government for just baseline court funding, tribal police funding, tribal justice systems funding. That's starting to change. In 2017, there was an appropriation at the federal level. It was one time, it's going to sunset soon, and we don't know what's coming next. So this would be an area that I would love to see more consideration in the California system. How can we partner? How can resources be allocated to tribal justice. What does that mean for non-recognized tribes? What does that mean for recognized tribes? And then what does that mean in terms of the high number of cases we see just in child welfare from tribes outside of California? I mean, when we're talking about justice, I think we need to look at the community as a whole, which is much bigger than just the recognized, non-recognized discussion. There's a lot of there's children, vulnerable children who are our Native brothers and sisters here that need support. So in closing, I want to just remind everyone of the fact that at one point, the governor in California, is the very first governor back in 1851, was waging a war of extermination. I will enter into the record the historic quote that a war of extermination will continue to be waged between the races until the Indian race becomes extinct, must be expected. And I only bring that up today to remind everyone that it's important to look back so that we can continue to look forward. So while we're looking at, this was the first governor of California was waging a war of extermination. Now we're being invited by the governor's office to look at something different. California Truth and Healing Council, moving forward, recognizing that that is our legacy and our past in California. And what are we going to do with that? And how are we going to move forward? So to me, I feel like, we're not here as in the Truth and Healing Council to assign blame as much as we are to look at where we can go and go forward. Truth and Healing to me is about building trust and honesty and having validation, acknowledging the past, but focusing on the future. What are our solutions to the problems that we know exist? And I just ask all of you on the council to keep the faith. It'll be hard at sometimes, I think, because there won't always be unified agreement or a unified voice. And that's what makes California tribal people so great, is our diversity. So just keep the faith that you will create the solutions that are going to set all of us up on a path for a brighter future for tribal people in California. And if the future is brighter for tribal people in California, keep the faith. That means it'll be brighter for everyone in California. And hopefully we can be a model for the rest of the nation as well. So that concludes my comments. Thank you all.
Thank you, Judge Williams. And it looks like we have a raised hand from Councilmember Sisk.
Yes, thank you. I just wanted to make a couple of comments and maybe just like pick your brain about how do we get from where we are right now to a better solution of justice? Because one, you mentioned the Indian child welfare and unrecognized tribes don't have the right to really stand up for our members if another recognized tribe wants to take that baby. And so that's one area, but not just another recognized tribe, but anybody could, we don't have that way in law to stand up for our members. And then also bringing up the American Indian Religious Freedoms Act, that unrecognized tribes and disenrolled members don't really have access to that law in supporting our religious beliefs or our ceremonies that we need to take care of. And so in reality, every time we do a ceremony, every time we collect medicines, every time we have a fire, those are all against the law because it's also not protected under the First Amendment. So those are just a couple of things that, justice is totally unfair to the unrecognized disenrolled people who are still struggling to carry on tribal ways of life. And then the next thing I wanted to think, get an opinion from you, or you can think about this too and later, is the disenrollments. It feels like the disenrollments might be at the center of the justice issues that oppose tribal governments to be the tribal court because of what had happened in disenrollments and the reasons for disenrollments and the ongoing harm that disenrollments has caused fractions of the families and the family systems in those cases. So, and then you said California doesn't have the amount of money that other states get for the justice system. And I was thinking, you know, like Arizona has 5 recognized tribes, and I haven't heard of any unrecognized tribes in Arizona. But their number for that tribal government and is higher. So if there was a way for the California state to impose or project the number of California Indians that are needing some sort of a justice representation, that maybe that number would rise. But when you look at individual tribes, and you know, the Redding Rancheria, it has like what, 210 members. They wouldn't probably get as much as, you know, a recognized tribe in Arizona or New Mexico or somewhere. And we have so many tribes that it's hard to get enough money for each one because they're expensive. Okay, that's my comments. Thanks.
Okay, I can quickly address some of those. So there are California statutes that do allow for participation by non-recognized tribes in Indian Child Welfare Act cases. And when there's a dispute as to membership of a tribe in terms of which tribe should be the lead tribe, there's a process under the California Child Welfare Codes that there's supposed to be sort of like a mini hearing, an evidentiary hearing to determine which tribe has most likely contacts with this child, and non-recognized tribal people are eligible for that. Where the real complication comes in is that because they're unrecognized, there's no list that allows for state workers to have that contact. So usually unrecognized tribes find themselves in the position of having to find out about the proceedings through family or in an informal way. And then it's really up to them to intervene and make themselves known in the court. But their voice is protected and heard under California law, which I have nothing to do with. I'm not affiliated with the California government. The American Indian Religious Freedom Act, believe it or not, pretty much applies evenly to both federally recognized and unrecognized tribes, in that it has absolutely no teeth and has been tried, and no one has been very successful. In the case that I'm most aware of, the determination was that tribes, whether they're federally recognized or not, wasn't really the issue, but are welcome to hold whatever beliefs they want, but that doesn't entitle them to access specific land unless it's held by them, for them, in trust. And so my tribe, federally recognized tribe, largest tribe in terms of population in the whole state of California, with 6,000 being somewhat significant, although pales in comparison to Navajo, which I'll get to next. And that we don't have any more access to lands that are outside of our particular holdings than anybody else would. And as you could imagine, a lot of our sacred places are not held in trust for us and may never be. So that's a problem we all need to look at. And I'm hoping that's something everyone can sort of just have their eyes open to. Okay. In terms of disenrollments, I'm a huge believer in sovereignty. And so I do feel like when it comes to determining tribal membership, tribes should be the one to make those determinations. I've never felt that the federal government or state government is better fit to solve any of those disputes. And I don't think that tribes necessarily always get it right. But again, I'm talking about that evolution. I think it's better to have tribes struggling through their own identity and creating their own futures. And maybe, some of us from the outside see those as mistakes in terms of the decisions or outcomes. But that's how people grow. That's how people evolve. And that's how people really become who they are. So I think, again, just a reminder, sovereignty is not given to anyone. So while I think it's important we're partnering with the state as tribal people to come up with solutions and ways to recognize a better future for California, some of the answers are within our own communities and between our communities. And we can't always look to external influences or entities for solutions. I think we look to them as partners. And then funding for tribal justice. Oh, don't get me started. So the federal government does sort of, as you're saying, it's not a pro rata share, which is actually something we've thrown around in the justice community. As should it just be that there's a pot of money dedicated for justice and then divided up based on population, so that tribes would get seemingly what they need to serve their people. In that case, yes, there are large populations outside of California. There isn't a solution that anyone agrees on yet. Right now, it really is based on tribal courts sort of applying for that funding, at least within California, and it is all federal. So there isn't a state set aside that I know of that would go to tribes other than maybe some competitive grant funding, which is what a lot of tribes utilize now through the federal government as well. So that's something that the larger justice community is always looking at, is how can we secure better funding and make sure that it's equitable in the division, and taking into account the fact that some tribes do have small populations and being realistic about that. But there is sort of a baseline you need to operate a justice system regardless of how many people it serves. So yeah, funding, I always just would like to see more, and I'd love to see more of it coming to California tribes. But until that, happens, something that as I've been really fortunate to be part of is establishing a consortium in Mendocino County, where 4 tribes were working together to try to, instead of compete with each other for limited finances, go after grants together and consolidate the administration of the court. So again, that's not something that was given to them by any outside entity. Those tribes came up with that solution themselves and saw a way to partner together to make what they had kind of go further for all of their people. So that's something that we're looking at in terms of innovations in courts in California. And then I've also was fortunate to be part of the first joint jurisdiction court with the Shingle Springs Band of Miwok Indians, where we got to sit with the El Dorado County Superior Court and hear cases together. And that was a way to sort of extend our sovereignty over juveniles when I was there, but it's growing and serving more people as well. And then we're hoping at the Wilton Tribal Court to be doing that sooner rather than later with Sacramento. And then just happy to see that model spreading across California. So thank you all so much for your time. If there's any other questions, Loretta can tell me.
Thank you, Judge Williams. Your expertise. I learned something new every single time we have a presentation with you. But I do want to turn it over to Wilton Rancheria and be mindful of time. And they are in the room.
Finish out this panel with Wilton Rancheria, and then we'll open up for public comment. So over to you.
Hello again. My name is Steve Hutchison. I'm the TIPO for Wilton Rancheria. Thank you, Chief Judge Williams. Very interesting and important topics, and the rest of the presenters as well. Thank you for allowing me to speak here. Truth and Healing Council, I appreciate it. I just wanted to, tell a story about my slice of California, where I'm from, about some historic, figure of my tribe, and what he had to deal with through the early laws and policies of the state of California, and Spanish conquest, and so Alec Blue, my great-grandpa's great-grandfather, he was a headman from around the Sacramento Valley. When he was a young boy, he was kidnapped by the Spanish-Mexican Army and taken to Mission San Jose. They came and took him away from this area known as the Great Sacramento Valley, and he was taken to the mission to perform forced slave labor. He always told himself that he would not stay there. That is not a place he wanted to be. He was always looking for a way to get out, a way to escape that horrible place. Before he finally escaped, he told this special girl that he would be back someday to get her. They were just children at the time. He kept traveling by night and sleeping and hiding during the day. Finally, he got all the way back here to the Sacramento Valley, where he was taken from. And he came to a big cornfield, and he thought that would be a good place to hide and sleep during the day, in the middle of that cornfield. So that's what he did. He slept clear through until the next morning, and a farmer named Mackenzie found him there. The farmer noticed how bad and malnutrition he looked, and so he told him he didn't have to get up, he could stay and sleep, or if he wanted, he could go up to the house and have some water and get something to eat and continue to rest. So he did that. He stayed longer. One day led to another. The farmer let him stay. He then became to work on that ranch. This was either because of the passage of the Act for Government and Protection of Indians, that indentured California Indians, or because the rancher appreciated his work. I think it was more of the latter, because it was said they became good friends. He was a great horseman. Many of those settlers weren't very good. They depended on the California Indians to acclimate these places they settled for their survival into the modern era. A lot of these settlers wouldn't have made it first, second, third, or even fourth generations if it wasn't for those California Indians to help them, their European cattle and those Spanish horses, just for the survival of those animals. Eventually, he was given some land to build a house on that ranch. He worked with those early ranching families in the South Sacramento Valley, and they liked him. After many years of being a ranch hand and now with his own place, he went back to the Mission San Jose area to get that young lady that he promised all those years before. They soon married and lived there on the ranch. She was a Miwok from what is now the Mount Diablo area. Because of his stature in this area as a leader and headman, he negotiated with the Department of War, Bureau of Indian Affairs, for the creation of many of the rancherias in this area for the homeless Indians, to protect homeless Indians who the settlers termed homeless, who according to the laws on the books at the time were considered indigent Indians and could be taken and enslaved all the way into the 20th century. He was instrumental for the creation of the Wilton Rancheria, where most of his descendants are now members. He negotiated with the Department of War, Bureau of Indian Affairs for these rancherias, for the care and safety of his people and our family. Wilton Rancheria was officially established in 1928 under the California Indian Jurisdiction Act, the Lee Act. Unfortunately, in 1958, the California Rancheria Termination Act was passed to distribute the rancheria lands to individual families that lived there. The Wilton Rancheria was officially terminated in 1964. In 1991, surviving members of Wilton Rancheria reorganized their government, and in 1999, petitioned the United States to restore us to federal recognition. 10 years later, on June 8, 2009, a U.S. District Court judge gave Wilton Rancheria restoration, officially restoring the tribe to a federally recognized tribe. Thank you, Camus. Thank you.
Have any council member discussion, reactions? Anyone virtually joining us? Then at this time, we'll open up for public comment.
We have one hand raised currently. I'll allow Laura Williams to speak. Allow. Or you should be able to mute yourself now. Ask them to unmute again, but they are allowed to unmute themselves and make public comment. Laura Williams, you can make comment now. Laura doesn't seem to be unmuting herself currently. We'll move to Roman Raintree. Roman, you should be able to unmute yourself and make comment.
Hi, thank you. This is Dr. Williams, but go ahead. Take him first. Sorry.
Go ahead, Roman.
Yes, hi. Thank you. It's an honor to be here. Thank you. I'm a member of well, all my tribal lineage is non-federally recognized, and I hear that being talked about here and there. And I really want to thank you, Chief Sisk, for speaking up. I heard you yesterday. I've gone through that recording online multiple times, and I want to thank you for representing and saying those words on behalf of the plight of non-federally recognized California Indians. My question really is, I've been, for the better part of this year, laying the groundwork for how we can, as a non-federally recognized California Indians, begin to get a nod of acknowledgement. And I kept yesterday trying to figure out how I would come across in a positive way, in a good way. I don't mean to place no blame. I don't mean to place any fault with anybody. I just come to ask because I have this idea after reading up and that the final report will be submitted by 2025. I've been calling and I haven't made it through every single tribe in California with a pending federal petition for federal acknowledgement. I've been calling them all, And the more I've been calling, the more I've been emboldened and strengthened in my resolve to create a change.org petition. One that specifically states that we call upon Governor Newsom to utilize his powers of executive order, authorizing the creation of a formal process to legally recognize tribes, define the procedures for doing so, and empower the California Native American Heritage Commission to confer all eligible California tribes with state recognition, granting equal rights and privileges afforded by the state of California to all formally acknowledged tribes indigenous within its boundaries, notwithstanding federal tribal status. That really is like the crux of what I wanted our change.org petition to be. And I say federal, I mean, the executive order, because we can't wait till 2025. We're constantly losing our elders. I'm 40 years old, and my tribe has been petitioning formally for acknowledgement since before I was born. This is an intergenerational plight that is inherited. And so that's why I teamed up with my son on this. So it will be a co-youth-led effort because they deserve better. They deserve the equal rights as any other California Indian has. And they shouldn't have to inherit this plight and have to think about it in the ways that I'm trying to think about outside the box and how to navigate not only California politics and native politics in California, but also tribal politics. And then within that, family politics. When we have something at our resource, I feel like if we ask, that maybe with a little talking and understanding. And I think it really goes back when I call these other tribes and I speak to other tribal members and I hear where they're at. Some of them are already being denied their federal acknowledgement. And when I read on OFA, the Office of Federal Acknowledgement, and I read those the results and why they're determining them to be no longer tribal, they break it down real simple. And this is what I keep hearing is that they're no longer tribes. They're just handfuls of families connected. And it's starting to sound like my people here at home. And I hear that a lot. And so my question is that within Governor Newsom's purview of power to issue an executive order of something of that magnitude, something of that nature? Because when I reach out, a lot of people were just kind of taken back in 2019 when none of us were invited to that apology. And here, what really kind of spurned it was 2 weeks ago when the Truth County Council Healing Process had their meeting, but it wasn't, because you guys couldn't have quorum. One of my elders called in and he asked, when are you guys going to get to this? When are you going to talk about this? Because the truth is, California sent its delegates, and there are a large reason why those treaties never got ratified, got hidden. And had those been ratified, we would have had our federal acknowledgement. And so California bears a huge responsibility for that. And that's the truth. And the healing begins with us, the forgotten, the lost tribes, if you will. And I'm not really seeing that. I mean, I feel for everybody else, but at the same time, I go back to what I heard yesterday from one of the elders. We're a people where, when we would move, our weakest and our eldest were setting the pace for the entire group, all of our people. We're only as strong as our weakest link, and the federally non-acknowledged California Indian tribes are that here in California. And so I'm a little troubled when I want to move forward in a positive way. And I don't want to, point any blame. But when I do my research on the tribal advisor and the deputy tribal advisor, and I see that, you're only able to sympathize with us. You're not able to empathize with this because you're not from a non-federally acknowledged tribe. It's not every day with you. It's not who you are. It's not a part of your identity as it is with some of us. So my question again, does Governor Newsom have it within his power of authority to issue an executive order to create a formal process for state recognition like 13 other tribes do? Thank you.
Thank you, Roman. Regrettably, my timer didn't start. So just to next commenters, remember we have a 3-minute timer on comments. So give me a second here. Laura, you should be allowed to speak and make comment.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can.
Hi, I'm Dr. Laura Williams. I'm the first California Indian woman to be a physician. And the first is Emmett Chase. And my concern about, you have been discussing about removing all the the statutes, etc. That's actually counter to the treatment for PTSD or traumatic stress disorder. So have you engaged professional psychiatrists and psychologists in opinions would be my question in relationship to the processing. There's a treatment called narrative exposure therapy, which allows you to contextualize traumatic expressions. So when you remove the object, you can't change history. You can't suppress it. It has to be dealt with directly through counseling and treatment, including EMDR and other approaches. So that's my first question. What academic and or healthcare professionals, including psychiatrists and psychologists, have been utilized by the California Truth and Healing Council to comment and address these issues? That's my question.
Thank you, Laura. Give me a second here. You'd be the next person to make comment. You should be able to make comment and unmute yourself now.
Yes, thank you for letting me speak. And I know I've brought this up again and again and again, but you know, yesterday I had a meeting with the Heard Museum regarding the Indian Arts and Crafts Act and California Indians. And it's becoming a huge issue, not just for me, but for other California Indians, as well as like the Autry Museum and some of our other state museums or publicly funded museums in California. And I think that one of the things that could resolve that, instead of us trying to find these workarounds, although the Autry seems to have a workaround, the Heard is going to run it by the Indian Arts and Crafts Board to see if it's a workaround. But as it is, until we have an official state recognition, California Indians cannot participate in any Indian art markets or any Indian art venues or even label their art Indian art. And it's severely impacting a lot of artists. And I know, again, I keep bringing it up, but I just don't see any movement or anybody hearing it or anybody supporting any kind of legislative action to support state recognized or state acknowledged California Indian people. And so I just really want to keep this conversation in the forefront. You know, I did bring up the criteria that we have and that, you know, while it's not an official state recognition, it does have some criterion. But the concern is the criterion. And, you know, everyone knows that there are people on the list that should not be on the list. And so I think, you know, by having an official state recognition process, or at least advocating for that, would eliminate so much of the problems and issues that I've heard today. And so I just really want to have that, you know, and support others that are saying the same thing. You know, it would really solve a lot of problems for a lot of people and a lot of communities to have an official state recognition process. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you, Leah. The next person to speak will be Kathy. Kathy, you should be able to unmute yourself and make comment now.
Hilly, where to start? First of all, I totally empathize with the caller that spoke about the problems of the unrecognized tribes and with Chief Colleen Sisk regarding the difficulties of her, tribal people even unable to have the resources necessary to practice their traditions and have those areas protected and set apart when they have traditional ceremonies. I mean, it is really hurtful and sad that we have so many groups of Indian people and individuals that are unable to participate in a way with our land and our culture. Also, yesterday in listening to the proclamation that Christina read, as we spoke about the atrocities of California against Indian people, I couldn't help but see the parallels of the gold rush and what now I consider the new genocide against our Indian people, which is tribal disenrollment. I have to differ with Judge Williams in the fact that this is a sovereignty issue and it's a growing pains issue within tribes. It is absolutely not. It is a power play for both monies and power, and it is destroying our Indian communities just as succinctly as the gold rush destroyed our Indian communities in the past. It has to stop. We have to stand up against it. And I really feel that the comment that one of the other council members made yesterday at the event, that when good people stand by and allow these things to happen, the evil persists, because it's true. By not touching these situations and by, acting that there's sovereignty, it is actually the abuse of sovereignty that will eventually erode the sovereignty for every tribe. And, that is my belief about that situation. But also I wanted to say that I spoke with David Wilkins, who is a friend of mine, and he absolutely said he would be very happy to consult with this council regarding the disenrollment issues. For those who don't know who he is, he wrote the book Dismembered, which thoroughly examines the disenrollment situation, and in which California is a huge part of that, with over 11,000 people disenrolled from tribes, and the great majority of them in California. So I'm saying this is an issue that's important and it needs to be spoken to, as does the problem of unrecognized tribes in California. Thank you.
All right, the next person with their hands raised is Louise. You should be able to unmute yourself, Louise.
Hello, Louise Ramirez, Tribal Chairwoman for Launi Coast-Kanoa Nation Nation. I'd like to say thank you to Council Member Kusla Kessler-Mata for bringing up the information that she did, as well as Chief Sisk, who has stood strong both days for those of us that are not federally recognized, and for today with Roman Raintree. I think, in my opinion, the best thing this committee can do is set up a procedure to acknowledge non-recognized tribes. There is no healing ever if something isn't done for that, because now we have Indians telling us that we're nothing. If you can't arrange for something to assist those of us, you talked about no tribes from San Francisco through down to Santa Barbara area, except for the Chumash. All of our coastal tribes are not federally recognized. We know who we are. We've submitted documentation. And in 2015, when the BIA changed its regulations, they removed many of us from even their acknowledgement list. So you have to start all over. And this has cost a lot of money, and you all know that. And if you don't stand for us, why should we expect non-Indians to stand for us? Thank you.
All right, that was the last hand raised.
Thank you, James. With that, thank you all for attending, those of you who attended in person for either day of the events. And thank you all for joining us virtually. That wraps the official portion of this first quarterly meeting.